It's not a new idea that some prejudices are considered more acceptable than others. Psychologists like Chris Crandall have researched that extensively. But in 2011, I and Professor Miles Hewstone of the Department of Experimental Psychology at Oxford University wanted to demonstrate that two specific groups were targets of socially accepted prejudice, and to find a way of measuring this acceptance that would work between cultures as well as within cultures.
The first group was people with schizophrenia. Prejudice against people with mental health issues is widespread and devastating. People with schizophrenia receive some of the worst of it. Two large-scale population surveys in Britain revealed that people with schizophrenia are generally stereotyped as dangerous and unpredictable. Furthermore, it's often said that prejudice against people with schizophrenia is widely accepted. Many have pointed to indirect indications of this acceptance, like openly offensive media portrayals, or the widely accepted use of prejudiced language. But no one had ever empirically demonstrated that this prejudice was widely accepted. So we did it. And we did it by comparing this prejudice to a prejudice that's prevalent but not widely accepted: prejudice against black people. Despite some progress, black people still have it pretty hard. In a study of prejudice against 7 racial groups in 4 European countries, the strongest racism was white British participants' response to Afro-Caribbeans. White British children also show more prejudice against the African Caribbean British than against the Asian British or the Oriental British. But even though racial prejudice is still prevalent, expressing racism is increasingly prohibited. So it's a good kind of prejudice to compare to prejudice against people with schizophrenia. How did we do it? We measured participants' acceptance of both prejudices with the widely used Internal Motivation to Appear Non-Prejudice Scale, or IMS. This scale measures participants' suppression of prejudice due to internalized egalitarian motives. This was our critical measure. We expected participants to report a lot of internal motivation to suppress prejudice against black people, but less of it concerning prejudice against people with schizophrenia. We also included the External Motivation to Appear Non-Prejudice Scale, or EMS. This scale measures the disjunction between one's personal internalized motives and the views of the wider community. We didn't expect to find a lot of external motivation for either group, nor did we expect to find big differences between the two groups. This pattern of results, a 2-by-2 interaction, is exactly what we found. A big difference in internal motivation to suppress prejudice and a smaller difference in external motivation, with participants reporting more motivation to suppress prejudice against black people than prejudice against people with schizophrenia. So study 1 showed that one prejudice was more accepted than another within a single society. But how could we show that the same prejudice was more accepted in one society than another, while taking into account cultural differences concerning the expression of prejudice? That's what we did in study 2. Anti-gay prejudice occurs in many different countries and takes many forms, but it's often said that anti-gay prejudice is considered more acceptable in Jamaica than in other countries, like the United States of America or the United Kingdom. Again, many people have pointed to highly visible, sometimes international incidents of Jamaican gay bashing or anti-gay violence. Others have analyzed the content of Jamaican media or popular songs, but no one had ever demonstrated this difference empirically. So we gave it a shot. We used the same scales as before, the IMS and the EMS, modified to measure motivation to suppress anti-gay prejudice. But by themselves, these scales would not be enough. And why not? Let's say we found huge differences between Jamaica and the other 2 countries in willingness to express anti-gay prejudice. Would that alone show that Jamaicans were more accepting of anti-gay prejudice? No. Jamaican participants may simply be more honest or less PC, or maybe some other cultural factor would lead them to respond differently from the American and British participants. To do this properly, we needed 2 other measures of motivation to control non-specific prejudice. If we were right, we should find small differences in motivation to control non-specific prejudice, but big differences in motivation to control anti-gay prejudice between the 3 country samples. And just like in the last study, we should find that the difference in internal motivation between the countries is big, while the difference in external motivation is relatively small. That's what we call a 3-way interaction, and it's exactly what we found. It might seem a bit tricky to follow, But the important thing is that Jamaican participants reported less internal motivation to control anti-gay prejudice than either American or British participants, and that all other differences between the participants were smaller or absent or even reversed. Both studies showed exactly what we hypothesized. Our first study demonstrated that our British participants were more accepting of prejudice against people with schizophrenia than of prejudice against black people. Our second study demonstrated that our Jamaican participants were more accepting of anti-gay prejudice than our American or British participants. And equally important, we demonstrated that these differences were detectable even when we took into account possible overarching cultural differences concerning the expression of prejudice in general. So for now, we could call it a day. If you want to cite this research, you can cite it as West and Hewstone M Press, The Social Acceptability of Prejudice Within and Between Societies, in the Journal of Community and Applied Social Psychology. The paper is about to come out, and as soon as it does, I'll attach the issue and page numbers to the citation. There's a lot of detail in the paper that I left out of the video, so if you're a psychologist or a psychology student, you'll probably want to read it. The music you're listening to is by Mr. Major P, and is one of the few Jamaican songs that openly denounces anti-gay prejudice. As always, I love feedback, so feel free to send me a YouTube message or an email. I am, after all, a social psychologist, so I like to know what you think. Take care.